The howl pierced the twilight air, freezing Bethany Sullivan's blood as she realized she was no longer alone on the desolate Wyoming trail. It was 1878, and the unforgiving landscape of the frontier had never felt more threatening than it did in this moment, with the sun rapidly disappearing behind the jagged mountain peaks. The 24-year-old schoolteacher clutched her traveling bag closer to her chest, her knuckles whitening as she quickened her pace along the dusty path that led to the small frontier town of Rivercross. Bethany had come west from Boston just 3 months prior, answering an advertisement for a schoolteacher in the Wyoming Territory. With her parents both lost to influenza the previous winter, and no prospects for marriage in her hometown, the opportunity had seemed like Providence itself. Now, as another chilling howl echoed through the dimming light, followed by several more in response, she questioned the wisdom of her decision to walk the 2 miles back to town after visiting a student's family on their homestead. The first set of yellow eyes appeared at the edge of the trail ahead, gleaming in the fading light. Bethany stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. Another pair of eyes emerged from the brush to her left, then another to her right. Coyotes. At least 5 of them, moving with predatory purpose, encircling her with methodical precision. "Dear Lord," she whispered, backing away slowly, her boots sliding on loose gravel. She had heard stories of coyotes attacking lone travelers, especially when food was scarce. The unusually dry summer had driven game from the area, making desperate predators even more dangerous. A twig snapped beneath her heel, and the nearest coyote advanced, lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed yellowed teeth. Bethany's hand trembled as she raised her bag as a shield, knowing it would offer little protection. The circle tightened, and a whimper escaped her lips as she realized there was nowhere to run. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the twilight stillness, sending the coyotes scattering momentarily. Bethany spun toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man on horseback emerged from the shadows, rifle still raised. He fired again into the air, causing the remaining coyotes to retreat further into the brush. With fluid grace, he dismounted and strode toward her, his spurs jingling with each step. "You're safe with me," he said, his voice deep and steady as he lowered his rifle. The brim of his worn Stetson lifted, revealing features carved by sun and wind, a strong jaw, darkened with stubble, keen eyes the color of a summer storm, and a mouth that seemed more accustomed to stern lines than smiles. Bethany felt her knees weaken with relief, and she swayed slightly where she stood. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "Owen Sutherland," he offered, touching the brim of his hat. "And you'd be the new schoolteacher, I reckon," Bethany nodded, still trembling. "Bethany Sullivan. I'm afraid I misjudged the distance back to town." Owen glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the brush where the coyotes had disappeared. "They'll be back. Best get you to town." He gestured to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that stood patiently nearby. "Rusty here can carry us both." Before Bethany could respond, a distant howl carried on the evening breeze. Owen's expression hardened, and he moved with decisive quickness, securing his rifle in its saddle holster before effortlessly lifting Bethany onto his horse. She gasped at the unexpected contact, her hands instinctively grasping the saddle horn as he swung up behind her. "Hold tight," he instructed, his breath warm against her ear as he reached around her to take the reins. The solid wall of his chest pressed against her back, and Bethany found herself acutely aware of the impropriety of their position, and equally aware that propriety mattered little when faced with a pack of hungry coyotes. As they rode toward Rivercross, Bethany gradually relaxed against the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the secure presence of the man behind her. The twilight deepened around them, stars beginning to glitter in the vast Wyoming sky. "You're new to these parts," Owen observed, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Yes," Bethany replied, grateful for the conversation to distract her from both the lingering fear and the unsettling awareness of his proximity. "I arrived from Boston in June." "Boston," he repeated, as though the word itself carried the weight of another world. "Long way from home." "This is my home now," she said with more conviction than she felt. The truth was that Rivercross still felt foreign to her, its ways and people as unfamiliar as the terrain itself. "What brought you all the way out here? Most Eastern ladies aren't exactly eager to trade city comforts for frontier living." Bethany hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this stranger. "I wanted a fresh start," she finally said, "and the town needed a teacher." Owen didn't press further, and Bethany was grateful. The loss of her parents was still a raw wound, and her reasons for leaving Boston included memories too painful to share with someone she had just met, regardless of how heroically he had appeared. As they crested a small rise, the lights of Rivercross came into view, scattered like fallen stars against the darkening plain. Relief flooded through Bethany at the sight of civilization. "I live at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house," she said as they approached the town's main street. Owen nodded. "I know it. She makes the best apple pie west of the Mississippi." The streets were relatively quiet as they rode through town, though several people called greetings to Owen as they passed. Bethany noted that while the greetings were friendly, they carried a distinct note of respect, perhaps even caution. She wondered what position Owen held in the community that warranted such deference. When they reached the boarding house, a two-story white clapboard structure with a wide front porch, Owen dismounted first, then reached up to help Bethany down. His hands were strong and calloused as they spanned her waist, and for a brief moment as her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that Bethany could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "Thank you again, Mr. Sutherland," she said, taking a step back and smoothing her skirts, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance after the ordeal. "I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Just Owen is fine." "And you're welcome, Miss Sullivan. I'd suggest not wandering too far from town alone, especially as evening approaches. These parts can be dangerous for those not familiar with them." "I've learned that lesson well tonight," Bethany assured him. "I won't be so careless again." Owen tipped his hat. "Good evening, then, Miss Sullivan. I expect we'll be seeing each other around." As he mounted his horse and rode away, Bethany watched until he disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did she realize that she knew nothing about him beyond his name, and the fact that he had, without question, saved her life. Mrs. Holloway, a plump, energetic widow in her 50s, was full of questions when Bethany entered the boarding house. "Mercy, child. Is that Owen Sutherland's horse I heard? What on earth were you doing riding with him at this hour?" The older woman's eyes were wide with curiosity as she ushered Bethany into the warmth of the front parlor. "I was walking back from the Miller farm when I was surrounded by coyotes," Bethany explained, sinking gratefully into an armchair near the fire. "Mr. Sutherland happened along and drove them off, then insisted on bringing me safely to town. Coyotes!" Mrs. Holloway exclaimed, pressing a hand to her ample bosom. "Lord have mercy! You could have been killed. Thank goodness Owen was there." She bustled about, pouring a cup of tea from the pot that perpetually simmered on the side table. "Though I must say, it's unusual for him to involve himself with newcomers. Keeps to himself mostly, does Owen Sutherland." Bethany accepted the tea gratefully. Who exactly is he? Everyone seemed to know him as we rode through town. Mrs. Holloway settled into the chair opposite, clearly relishing the opportunity to share information. He's something of a legend in these parts. Former Army scout during the war, then a Texas Ranger for a spell. Now he works as a bounty hunter and guide, though some say he does secret work for the government tracking outlaws across the territories. A bounty hunter, Bethany repeated, the image of the stern-faced man who had rescued her taking on new dimensions. One of the best, they say. Been known to bring in men that no one else could find. Mrs. Holloway leaned forward conspiratorially. They say he tracked the Cassidy gang through a blizzard for 14 days straight, brought them all in alive when the army had given them up for lost. Bethany sipped her tea, contemplating this information. He seemed intense. That he is. Lost his wife and baby daughter to Comanche raiders about 8 years back while he was away tracking a fugitive. Some say he's never been the same since. Mrs. Holloway shook her head sadly. Keeps that ranch of his running, but spends more time in the wilderness than at home. Not that any of the local ladies haven't tried to change that situation. The knowledge of Owen's tragic past stirred Bethany's compassion. She knew all too well the hollow ache of losing family, though she couldn't imagine the additional burden of guilt he must carry for not being there to protect them. "Well, I'm grateful he was there tonight," she said simply. Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "As am I, dear, as am I. Now, you must be famished after such an ordeal. Let me fix you a plate before you retire." Later, as Bethany prepared for bed in her small but comfortable room, she found herself drawn to the window that overlooked the main street. The town was quiet now, most buildings dark except for the saloon at the far end, its windows glowing with lamplight. She wondered if Owen had gone there after leaving her, or if he had returned to the ranch Mrs. Holloway had mentioned. As she turned away from the window, her gaze fell on the small writing desk where she kept her journal. Sitting down, she opened it and began to write about the day's events. When she reached the moment of Owen's appearance, her pen paused over the paper. How did one adequately describe a man who emerged from the gathering darkness like some avenging angel, whose very presence scattered predators and made her feel, for the first time since arriving in this wild territory, truly safe? In the end, she simply wrote, "I met a man named Owen Sutherland today. He saved me from coyotes and possibly saved my life. There is something about him that suggests depths I cannot fathom, like looking into a well and being unable to see the bottom." Bethany closed her journal and prepared for sleep, unaware that the encounter that evening had set in motion events that would change the course of her life forever. The following week passed without any sign of Owen Sutherland in Rivercross. Bethany returned to her teaching duties at the small schoolhouse on the edge of town, guiding the education of 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 16. She found herself scanning the streets whenever she walked through town, both hoping for and dreading another encounter with her rescuer. On Friday afternoon, as Bethany was erasing the chalkboard after dismissing her students, a shadow darkened the schoolhouse doorway. She turned, expecting to see one of her pupils returning for a forgotten slate or book. Instead, Owen Sutherland stood there, his tall frame filling the entrance, hat in hand. "Mr. Sutherland," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Good afternoon, Miss Sullivan." He nodded, stepping inside but remaining near the door as though uncertain of his welcome. "I was in town for supplies and thought I'd check to see how you were faring after your encounter with the local wildlife." Bethany set down the eraser, brushing chalk dust from her hands. "I'm well, thank you, and I've been very careful about my wanderings since then." A hint of approval flickered in his eyes. "Glad to hear it. Wyoming isn't forgiving of carelessness, so I've discovered. She gestured to one of the student desks. Would you like to sit? I was just finishing for the day. Owen glanced at the small desk with a raised eyebrow but declined with a shake of his head. Thank you, but I should be getting back to my ranch before dark. Just wanted to make sure you were settling in all right. Bethany was touched by his concern, unexpected as it was. That's very kind of you. I am settling in, though I admit it's quite different from Boston. I imagine so. His gaze swept around the simple schoolroom with its rows of desks, wall maps, and modest bookshelf. You like teaching? Very much, Bethany replied, warming to the subject. The children here are eager to learn, though some of them have had little formal education before now. Owen nodded thoughtfully. Education's important out here. These kids will be building the future of this territory. He shifted slightly, and Bethany noticed a package tucked under his arm that she hadn't seen before. Following her gaze, Owen seemed almost embarrassed as he extended the package toward her. Almost forgot. Thought this might be useful for your school. Surprised, Bethany accepted the parcel and unwrapped the brown paper to reveal 3 books. A comprehensive atlas of the United States, a collection of Shakespeare's works, and a beautifully illustrated volume of Aesop's fables. Mr. Sutherland, she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed covers. These are wonderful. The children will be thrilled, especially with the atlas. Our current maps are woefully outdated. Figured as much, he said, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. Got them from a book dealer passing through from Denver. Thought they might fill some gaps in your library. Bethany looked up at him, reassessing this man who most in town seemed to regard with a mixture of awe and wariness. This is incredibly thoughtful. Thank you. Owen shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze. It's nothing. Knowledge is as important a tool as any rifle or hunting knife out here. An idea struck Bethany. Would you consider speaking to my students someday about your experiences as a scout and guide? Many of them have never been beyond the boundaries of Rivercross, and I think they would benefit greatly from hearing about the wider territory from someone who knows it so well. Owen's expression grew guarded. I'm not much for public speaking, Miss Sullivan. They're children, not a public assembly, Bethany countered gently. And they would be fascinated. Most of the boys already whisper about your exploits whenever you ride through town. A grimace crossed his face. Exaggerated tales, I'm sure. All the more reason to give them the truth, she suggested. Owen was silent for a moment, considering. I'll think on it, he finally said, which Bethany suspected was as close to agreement as she was likely to get. That's all I ask. She smiled, clutching the books to her chest. And thank you again for these. They're a wonderful addition to our resources. Owen nodded, placing his hat back on his head. Good day, Miss Sullivan. As he turned to leave, Bethany called after him. Will you be attending the Harvest Festival next weekend? The whole town will be there. He paused in the doorway, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. Not much for festivals either, I'm afraid. That's a shame, Bethany said, surprising herself with her boldness. I was hoping for a dance partner who could keep the Coyotes at bay. For a moment, Owen looked so startled that Bethany feared she had overstepped. Then, unexpectedly, a genuine smile transformed his face, erasing years of hardness and revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before tragedy struck. Well, when you put it that way, Miss Sullivan, perhaps I'll reconsider. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Bethany with the strange sensation that something significant had just transpired between them, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The next week passed in a flurry of activity as Bethany helped prepare for the Harvest Festival. The entire town was involved, from the youngest children crafting decorations to the oldest residents overseeing the traditional foods that would be served. It was Rivercross's biggest celebration of the year, marking the end of the growing season and the beginning of preparation for the long winter ahead. As Saturday approached, Bethany found herself spending more time than usual considering her appearance. She had brought only a few dresses from Boston, most practical for teaching. For the festival, she decided on her best dress, a deep burgundy with subtle lace trim at the collar and cuffs. It wasn't the height of Eastern fashion, but it brought out the warm tones in her chestnut hair and complemented her fair complexion. Mrs. Holloway noticed her preparations with knowing eyes. "My, don't you look lovely? Anyone in particular you're hoping to impress?" Bethany felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Not at all. I simply want to look my best for the festival." Mrs. Holloway hummed skeptically. "Well, half the eligible men in town have been asking after you since you arrived. I expect you'll have your dance card filled before the first fiddle plays." The festival was held in the town square, which had been transformed with lanterns, bunting, and tables laden with food. A wooden platform served as a dance floor, and a small band of local musicians tuned their instruments as townspeople began to gather in the early evening. Bethany was immediately swept into the festivities, greeting parents of her students and being introduced to residents she hadn't yet met. She kept glancing toward the edges of the gathering, searching for a particular tall figure. But as the evening progressed and the dancing began, there was no sign of Owen Sutherland. Trying to hide her disappointment, Bethany accepted an invitation to dance from the young deputy sheriff, then from the blacksmith's son, and then from Mr. Peterson, who owned the general store. They were all pleasant companions, but none of them made her pulse quicken or her thoughts scatter the way a certain bounty hunter had with a single smile. It was during a brief respite between dances that Bethany felt a presence beside her. She turned to find Owen standing there, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a clean shirt and vest, his usually dusty boots polished to a shine. "Mr. Sutherland," she greeted him, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "You decided to come after all." "Seems I did," he replied, his eyes taking in her appearance with quiet appreciation. "You look very nice, Miss Sullivan." "Thank you, as do you." The compliment seemed to embarrass him, and Bethany quickly changed the subject. "Have you tried Mrs. Holloway's apple pie yet?" She wasn't exaggerating about its merits. Not yet. Owen glanced toward the dance floor where couples were forming for the next set. He cleared his throat. "I believe you mentioned something about needing a dance partner." Bethany's heart skipped a beat. "I did indeed." "I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer," he said, offering his arm nonetheless. "It's been a while." "I'm sure we'll manage," Bethany assured him, placing her hand on his arm and allowing him to lead her to the dance floor. Despite his disclaimer, Owen moved with the same fluid grace that Bethany had observed when he dismounted his horse that fateful evening. His hand was warm and steady at her waist, and he guided her through the steps of the country dance with quiet confidence. "For someone who claims not to be much of a dancer, you seem quite proficient," she observed as they circled each other. "Army functions," he explained briefly. "My wife used to insist I escort her." It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife, and Bethany felt a pang of sadness for his loss. She must have been a remarkable woman. Something flickered in Owen's eyes, pain, memory, or perhaps both. "She was brave enough to follow me to frontier outposts, determined to create a home wherever we were stationed." His voice softened. "Rebecca loved to dance." Bethany squeezed his hand gently in silent understanding. "I'm sure she would be glad to know you haven't forgotten how." The music carried them through the remainder of the dance without further conversation, but something had shifted between them. When the dance ended, Owen didn't immediately release her hand. "Would you walk with me for a moment?" he asked quietly. "It's a bit crowded here." Bethany nodded, and they made their way to the edge of the square, where lantern light gave way to the silver glow of a nearly full moon. The sounds of the festival music, laughter, conversations created a backdrop to their solitude. "I've been thinking about your invitation to speak to your students," Owen said after a moment. "I'm willing to do it, though I'm not sure what I could say that would be of value to them." Bethany smiled, genuinely pleased. "I think you underestimate yourself, Mr. Sutherland. Your knowledge of this territory, its geography and inhabitants, would be invaluable to children who will grow up making their lives here. Perhaps." He looked out toward the distant mountains, barely visible as darker shapes against the night sky. "This land can be harsh, but it has its own kind of beauty. Took me a long time to see it that way again after." He trailed off, but Bethany understood he was referring to the tragedy that had taken his family. "Loss changes how we see everything," she said softly. "When my parents died last winter, colors seemed to fade from the world for a time. Boston became unbearable, too many memories in every street and shop." Owen turned to look at her, his expression softening with shared understanding. "So you came west to outrun the ghosts?" "I suppose I did," Bethany admitted, "though I've since learned that ghosts can travel remarkably far." "That they can," Owen agreed, the hint of a sad smile touching his lips. "But new places can still offer new beginnings." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and Bethany felt a connection forming between them, built on the foundation of mutual loss and the tentative hope of moving forward. The moment was broken by the voice of Mayor Thompson calling for everyone's attention. Owen offered Bethany his arm once more. "Shall we return to the festivities?" As they walked back toward the gathering, Bethany was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. Clearly, Owen Sutherland's participation in the social life of Rivercross was unusual enough to draw notice, particularly in the company of the new schoolteacher. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly, with Owen staying by Bethany's side for much of it, though he declined to dance again. He did, however, sample Mrs. Holloway's famous apple pie, conceding that it lived up to its reputation. When the festival began to wind down, Owen offered to escort Bethany back to the boarding house. They walked in comfortable silence through the quiet streets, the sounds of the continuing celebration fading behind them. At the steps of the boarding house, Bethany turned to face him. "Thank you for coming tonight. I enjoyed your company very much." "As did I," Owen replied, his voice low in the stillness. "More than I expected to." Bethany smiled at his honesty. "When would you like to visit the school? The children have geography lessons on Tuesday mornings, which might be an appropriate time for your talk." "Tuesday would be fine," he agreed. "I'll be there around 10 if that suits." "Perfectly." Bethany hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you reconsidered about the festival." Owen's expression was thoughtful as he looked at her. "You know, Miss Sullivan, you're the first person in a long time who's made me want to reconsider a great many things." Before Bethany could respond to this surprising admission, he tipped his hat and bid her good night, leaving her standing on the porch with her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. Inside, Mrs. Holloway was waiting up, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Well now, that's caused quite a stir in town, you spending the evening with Owen Sutherland." "We simply enjoyed each other's company," Bethany said, trying to sound more casual than she felt. "He's agreed to speak to my students about the territory." "Has he indeed?" Mrs. Holloway raised her eyebrows. "That's not like him at all. Man barely speaks 2 words together most days, and now he's volunteering to address a classroom." Bethany busied herself removing her shawl. Perhaps he simply needed to be asked. Or perhaps he's found something or someone worth making an effort for, Mrs. Holloway suggested with a knowing look. Just be careful, dear. Owen Sutherland carries more shadows than most, and there are those who say he'll never truly leave the past behind. We all carry shadows, Mrs. Holloway, Bethany replied softly. Some are just more visible than others. That night, as Bethany prepared for bed, she found herself replaying moments from the evening, the surprising warmth of Owen's hand against hers as they danced, the rare smile that transformed his face, the way his eyes had softened when he spoke of new beginnings. There was something compelling about him beyond his handsome features, or the aura of quiet strength he projected. Perhaps it was the glimpses of the man beneath the hardened exterior, the man who had loved and lost, and somehow continued on. Bethany wrote in her journal late into the night, attempting to sort through her conflicting emotions. She had come to Wyoming to escape painful memories and begin anew, not to lose her heart to a man who, by all accounts, had walled his away years ago. Yet there was something about Owen Sutherland that called to her, like a voice across a vast distance that she strained to hear more clearly. Tuesday arrived with clear skies and a crispness in the air that hinted at the approaching autumn. Bethany found herself paying particular attention to her appearance that morning, selecting a neat blue dress and arranging her hair in a simple but flattering style. She arrived at the schoolhouse early to prepare the classroom and settle her unexpected nerves. The children were abuzz with excitement when they learned that the famous Owen Sutherland would be speaking to them. The boys, especially, could hardly contain themselves, whispering about his rumored exploits as a Texas Ranger and bounty hunter. Is it true he once tracked a murderer for 100 miles through a sandstorm? Young Timothy Baker asked eagerly. Or that he fought off 20 Comanche warriors single-handed, added Samuel Johnson, eyes wide. I'm sure Mr. Sutherland will be happy to separate fact from fiction when he arrives, Bethany told them with a smile. In the meantime, let's review our geography of the Wyoming Territory so that we can ask intelligent questions. At precisely 10 o'clock, Owen arrived, ducking his tall frame through the schoolhouse door. The classroom immediately fell silent, 23 pairs of eyes fixed on the legendary figure who now stood somewhat awkwardly before them. Good morning, Mr. Sutherland, Bethany greeted him warmly. We're so pleased you could join us today. Children, please welcome Mr. Sutherland. Good morning, Mr. Sutherland, the class chorused obediently. Owen nodded, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Morning. Bethany gestured to the front of the classroom. I've asked Mr. Sutherland to speak with us about the geography and natural features of our territory, as he has extensive experience traveling throughout the region. After his talk, you may ask questions, but remember to be respectful and raise your hands. As Owen moved to the front of the room, Bethany noticed that he had brought something with him, a rolled map, which he carefully unfolded and attached to the blackboard. This is a survey map of the Wyoming Territory, he explained, his deep voice carrying easily through the small room. More accurate than most you'll find in books, as it includes recent updates from government surveyors. To Bethany's delight and slight surprise, once Owen began speaking about the land he clearly knew so intimately, his initial discomfort faded. He pointed out mountain ranges, river systems, and natural landmarks, explaining how they affected travel, settlement, and the lifestyles of both native peoples and new settlers. The children listened with rapt attention as he described the different regions of the territory, from the high plains where Rivercross was situated to the majestic mountains to the west, and the stark badlands to the north. He spoke of natural resources, wildlife, and the changing seasons, painting a vivid picture of the world beyond their small town. When he opened the floor to questions, hands shot up immediately. Owen fielded their queries with patience, correcting misconceptions gently, and occasionally sharing brief anecdotes from his own experiences that had the children hanging on every word. Is it true you can predict the weather by watching animal behavior? Asked Mary Wilson, one of Bethany's brightest students. There's truth to that, Owen confirmed. Certain animals are sensitive to changes in air pressure that come before storms. Cattle will often lie down before rain. Birds fly lower. Ants build up the walls of their mounds before wet weather. Have you ever been lost? Samuel wanted to know. A hint of a smile touched Owen's lips. Not lost exactly, but I've been temporarily unsure of my exact location. This brought giggles from the children, and Bethany noticed that Owen seemed to relax further as the session continued. When Timothy finally asked about fighting Comanche warriors, Owen gently but firmly separated reality from the exaggerated tales. The Comanche are fierce warriors who defended their homeland, just as you would defend your families, he explained. I've had encounters with them, yes, but the stories you've heard are likely more tall tale than truth. It's important to understand that different peoples have different ways and beliefs, and respecting those differences is part of living together in this territory. Bethany was impressed by his thoughtful response, and the way he managed to teach an important lesson without being condescending to the boy who had asked the question. As the session drew to a close, Bethany stepped forward. Children, let's thank Mr. Sutherland for sharing his knowledge with us today. The class thanked him enthusiastically, and several of the boys looked as though they had just met their hero in the flesh. As the children filed out for their midday break, Owen carefully rolled up his map. That was wonderful, Bethany told him sincerely. You have a natural gift for teaching, Mr. Sutherland. Owen looked skeptical. I just told them what I know, which is precisely what teaching is, she pointed out. You engaged their interest and expanded their understanding. I couldn't have asked for more. A touch of color appeared on his weathered cheeks at her praise. They're good kids. Ask smart questions. They do, Bethany agreed, then added with a smile, though I notice you skillfully avoided answering whether you tracked a murderer through a sandstorm. The corner of Owen's mouth quirked upward. Some stories are best left mysterious, Miss Sullivan. Their eyes met, and Bethany felt that same inexplicable connection she had experienced at the festival. There was something about Owen Sutherland that drew her in, despite, or perhaps because of the careful barriers he maintained around himself. Would you care to join me for lunch? She asked impulsively. Mrs. Holloway packed more than enough, and the children won't return for an hour. Owen hesitated, and for a moment Bethany thought he would decline. Then he nodded. That would be nice. Thank you. They sat on the schoolhouse steps, sharing the simple but hearty lunch of bread, cheese, and apples. The October sun was warm despite the cool air, and Bethany found herself more relaxed in Owen's company than she had been with anyone since arriving in River Cross. How did you learn so much about this territory? She asked as they ate. Was it all through your work? Owen took a bite of apple before answering. Mostly. Started as an army scout during the war, then worked for the government mapping expeditions. You learn to read the land when your life depends on it. It must be magnificent seeing places that few others have laid eyes on, Bethany mused. It is, Owen agreed, his gaze drifting toward the distant horizon. There's a valley about 2 days' ride from here, high in the mountains. In spring, it's carpeted with wildflowers of every color imaginable. I found it by accident tracking a deserter. Spent the night there and watched the sunrise turn those flowers into something that looked like it belonged in a dream. Bethany was touched by this rare glimpse into his inner thoughts. "It sounds beautiful." "It is," he repeated softly. "Sometimes I think about building a cabin there. Somewhere peaceful." "Why don't you?" Bethany asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. Never seemed right somehow, finding peace. He looked down at his hands, strong and capable. "Not after what happened to Rebecca and our daughter." Bethany's heart ached for him. "I don't believe those we've lost would want us to deny ourselves peace, Owen." It was the first time she had used his given name, and he looked up, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Perhaps not," he conceded, "but some habits are hard to break." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they finished their meal. Owen asked about Bethany's life in Boston, and she told him about growing up as the daughter of a bookshop owner, surrounded by stories and ideas from around the world. "Books were my first adventures," she explained. "I traveled to distant lands and different times without ever leaving my father's shop." "And now you're living an adventure of your own," Owen observed. Bethany smiled. "Yes, though I admit it's not quite what I imagined when I read about the frontier as a girl." The novels neglected to mention the realities of outhouses in winter or the persistent presence of dust in everything. Owen's laugh was unexpected and wonderful, a deep, rich sound that Bethany immediately wanted to hear again. "No, I suppose they wouldn't include those details." Bad for recruiting Eastern school teachers. All too soon, it was time for the children to return from their break. As Owen prepared to leave, Bethany found herself reluctant to see him go. "Thank you again for today," she said. "The children learned more from you in an hour than they would have from weeks with textbooks alone." "It was my pleasure," Owen replied, and she could tell he meant it. He hesitated, then added, "I'm heading out tomorrow on a job. Shouldn't be gone more than a week or two." "Oh," Bethany said, trying to hide her disappointment. "What sort of job, if I may ask?" "Nothing dangerous this time," he assured her, correctly reading her concern. "Just guiding a government surveyor through some remote areas. Routine work." Bethany nodded, relieved. "Well, safe travels then." Owen studied her face for a moment, as though memorizing its features. "Would it be all right if I called on you when I return? Perhaps we could have dinner at the hotel restaurant." Joy bloomed in Bethany's chest at the unexpected invitation. "I would like that very much." "Good," Owen said simply. "Until then, Miss Sullivan." As he walked away, Bethany hugged the moment to herself like a precious gift. Whatever was developing between them, it felt like the beginning of something significant, a new chapter in a story she hadn't realized she was waiting to read. The days following Owen's departure seemed to stretch endlessly. Bethany threw herself into her teaching duties and participated in community activities, but her thoughts frequently strayed to the quiet bounty hunter who had so unexpectedly entered her life. Mrs. Holloway, ever observant, commented on Bethany's distraction one evening as they sat in the parlor, Bethany ostensibly grading assignments while the older woman worked on her knitting. "You know, dear, watching the road won't make him return any faster." Bethany looked up, startled. "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Holloway's knowing smile was kind. "You've been glancing out that window every few minutes for days now. And unless you've developed a sudden interest in the comings and goings of Mr. Peterson's delivery wagon, I'd wager you're looking for a certain tall gentleman on a chestnut horse." Heat crept into Bethany's cheeks. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching young people fall in love for 40 years, Mrs. Holloway replied gently. "And I must say, it's quite the talk of the town, you and Owen Sutherland." "There is no me and Owen Sutherland," Bethany protested, though the words lacked conviction even to her own ears. "We've merely enjoyed each other's company a few times." Hum," Mrs. Holloway hummed skeptically, her needles clicking steadily. And that's why he visited your classroom and asked you to dinner, something he's never done with any other young woman in Rivercross, despite numerous attempts to engage his interest. Bethany set aside her papers, giving up the pretense of work. He's an interesting man who's experienced terrible loss. Perhaps we simply understand each other in that regard. Perhaps, Mrs. Holloway conceded. Or perhaps you've managed to awaken feelings in him that he thought were buried with his wife. Either way, dear, tread carefully. Hearts that have been shattered once break all the more easily a second time. Bethany pondered the older woman's words long after they had bid each other good night. Was she falling in love with Owen? The possibility both thrilled and frightened her. She had come west seeking a new beginning, not necessarily a romantic attachment. Yet there was something about Owen that called to her on a level deeper than she had experienced before. 10 days after Owen's departure, Bethany was walking home from the schoolhouse when she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Owen riding toward her, his tall figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. Her heart leapt at the sight of him, confirming what she had begun to suspect about her feelings. Owen reined in his horse beside her, his face lighting with a smile that transformed his usually serious features. "Miss Sullivan." "Mr. Sutherland," she returned, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "Welcome back." He dismounted in one fluid motion, taking the reins in hand as he fell into step beside her. "Just got in. Thought I might find you heading home about now. How was your journey?" Bethany asked, noting the weariness around his eyes despite his evident good spirits. "Uneventful, which is always good in my line of work," Owen replied. "The surveyor got his measurements and we encountered nothing more dangerous than a disgruntled badger." Bethany laughed. "I'm glad to hear it, though I'm sure a badger can be formidable enough." "True enough," Owen agreed with a smile. "How have things been in Rivercross? Any excitement while I was away?" "Nothing to rival a disgruntled badger," Bethany assured him. "Though Mrs. Peterson did have her baby, a healthy boy they've named John." They continued in this pleasant exchange of news as they walked, Owen leading his horse alongside them. When they reached the boarding house, he hesitated. "I know I must look a fright after days on the trail," he said, running a hand self-consciously over his stubbled jaw. "But I was wondering if that dinner invitation might stand for tonight. I've been thinking about it for days." The admission sent a warm glow through Bethany. "I would love to have dinner with you tonight." Relief and pleasure crossed his face. "I'll clean up and come back for you in an hour if that suits." "Perfectly," Bethany assured him. True to his word, Owen returned in an hour, freshly bathed and shaved, wearing clean clothes that, while simple, showed care in their selection. His hair, still damp from washing, curled slightly at the ends, softening the usual severity of his appearance. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Rivercross, which wasn't saying much by Eastern standards, but the food was good and the atmosphere pleasant. As they were seated at a table near the window, Bethany was aware of the curious glances from other diners. Clearly, Owen Sutherland dining with the schoolteacher was still noteworthy enough to draw attention. Owen seemed to notice as well, but appeared determined to ignore it. "I hope you don't mind being the subject of town gossip," he said quietly as they settled at their table. "I don't," Bethany assured him. "Though I must admit, I'm curious why your having dinner with me is causing such interest." Owen's expression was wry. "I'm not exactly known for my social activities in Rivercross. Some folks probably thought I'd forgotten how to use a fork and knife, given how rarely I'm seen in public establishments." "Their loss," Bethany said lightly. "Your excellent company." The dinner was everything Bethany had hoped it would be. Away from curious eyes and ears, Owen relaxed, revealing a dry wit and thoughtfulness that complemented his more obvious qualities of strength and capability. He told her more about his travels, sharing stories of the natural wonders he had encountered and the interesting people he had met along the way. In turn, Bethany spoke of her life in Boston, her love of literature, and her hopes for her students in Rivercross. Owen listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest in her thoughts and experiences. As they finished their meal and lingered over coffee, Owen's expression grew more serious. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you, Bethany." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Yes, the Thanksgiving holiday is coming in a few weeks," he began, his fingers turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "I usually spend it alone at my ranch, but I was wondering if you might consider joining me there for dinner that day." The invitation surprised and touched Bethany. "I'd be honored, Owen, but won't you be lonely out there for the holiday?" A shadow crossed his face. "I've grown accustomed to solitude on holidays. After Rebecca and Emma died, celebrations seemed hollow, but this year for the first time I find myself wanting company." His eyes met hers. "Your company, specifically?" Bethany reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Then I would be delighted to join you." The weeks leading up to Thanksgiving were filled with a growing closeness between Bethany and Owen. He began to appear regularly in town, often timing his visits to coincide with the end of the school day so he could walk Bethany home. Sometimes they would stop at the small cafe for tea. Other times they simply walked and talked, getting to know each other more deeply with each encounter. Owen spoke more about his past, his childhood in Missouri, his time in the Army, and eventually, more about Rebecca and their daughter Emma. Bethany listened, honored by his trust in sharing these painful memories. "Emma would have been 10 this year," he told her one afternoon as they sat on a bench outside the general store. "She had Rebecca's eyes and laugh, but my stubborn streak. Used to insist on helping me with the horses when she was barely big enough to lift a brush." "She sounds wonderful," Bethany said softly. She was. Owen's voice was thick with emotion. "After they died, I couldn't bear to stay at the ranch. Took every job that would keep me away, tracking the worst criminals through the most God-forsaken places. Part of me was hoping I wouldn't come back." Bethany's heart ached for him. "But you did come back." "I did," he acknowledged. "Eventually, I realized that dying wouldn't honor their memory. Living might." "That takes tremendous courage," Bethany told him. Owen shook his head. "Not courage, just the slow realization that grief isn't something you escape. It's something you learn to carry." As Thanksgiving approached, the weather turned sharply colder. A light dusting of snow fell the week before the holiday, transforming Rivercross into a scene from a Christmas card. Bethany had never experienced a Western winter before, and found herself entranced by the stark beauty of the snow-covered plains stretching to the distant mountains. On Thanksgiving morning, Owen arrived at the boarding house in a wagon rather than on horseback. "The trail to my ranch can be treacherous in snow," he explained as he helped Bethany up onto the seat. "Thought this would be safer." The journey to Owen's ranch took nearly 2 hours, but Bethany hardly noticed the time passing as they talked. As they crested a rise, Owen's property came into view, a substantial log home with several outbuildings, nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills. "It's beautiful," Bethany said sincerely as they approached. "It's home," Owen replied simply, but she could hear the pride in his voice. Inside, the house was warm and inviting, with solid, well-crafted furniture and an impressive stone fireplace dominating the main room. Bethany was surprised by the number of books lining shelves along one wall, volumes on history, natural science, and literature that suggested a mind hungry for knowledge. Rebecca loved to read, Owen explained, following her gaze. Started the collection, and I've added to it over the years. Not much else to do during the long winter evenings. The kitchen was spacious and practical, and delicious smells emanated from the cast iron stove where a turkey was roasting. Bethany raised an eyebrow at Owen. "You've been cooking," he smiled. "Contrary to town gossip, I don't survive solely on jerky and coffee when I'm home. I actually enjoy cooking, though I rarely have occasion to prepare a proper holiday meal." As they worked together to complete the Thanksgiving dinner, Bethany was struck by how natural it felt to be in Owen's home, moving around his kitchen as though they had done this many times before. There was an ease between them now that had developed gradually over the weeks of their acquaintance. The meal was delicious roast turkey with all the traditional accompaniments, followed by an apple pie that Owen admitted he had purchased from Mrs. Holloway rather than attempting himself. "Even I know my limitations," he said with a grin as he served the pie. No man should try to compete with Mrs. Holloway's baking. After dinner, they settled in the main room before the fireplace, the warmth of the fire a pleasant contrast to the steadily falling snow visible through the windows. Owen added another log to the fire, then sat beside Bethany on the comfortable sofa. "Thank you for sharing this day with me," he said quietly. "It's the first holiday in years that has felt right." Bethany turned to face him, her heart full. "Thank you for inviting me. I can't imagine anywhere I'd rather be." Owen's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. Bethany felt her pulse quicken as he slowly leaned toward her, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. Instead, she met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with shared longing. Owen's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch reverent as their kiss continued, speaking volumes about feelings that had been building for weeks. When they finally parted, Owen rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as though savoring the moment. "I never expected to feel this way again," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "After Rebecca died, I thought that part of me was gone forever. And now?" Bethany asked, her heart pounding with hope and trepidation. Owen opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with an intensity that took her breath away. "Now, I find myself falling in love with a Boston schoolteacher who faces down coyotes and stubborn bounty hunters with equal courage." Joy bloomed in Bethany's chest at his words. "Is that what I'm doing? Facing down a stubborn bounty hunter?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Among other things." "Well then," Bethany said, reaching up to touch his face, "I should tell you that I'm falling in love with a certain stubborn bounty hunter myself." Their second kiss was deeper, filled with the joy of newfound love and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine. When they separated, Owen held her close, his strong arms encircling her as they watched the firelight dance across the room. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," he murmured against her hair. "Never thought I deserved it after failing to protect them." "You deserve happiness, Owen," Bethany said firmly, turning in his arms to look at him. "And you didn't fail. You were doing your duty, your job. The tragedy that took them wasn't your fault." Owen's expression was pained. "In my head I know that, but my heart—" "Your heart needs time," Bethany said gently. "And I'm willing to give you all the time you need." The snow continued to fall throughout the afternoon and into the evening, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. As darkness fell, Owen reluctantly admitted that the roads would be too dangerous to attempt the journey back to town. "You're welcome to take my bed," he offered. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." Bethany appreciated his concern for propriety. "Thank you. I'm sure Mrs. Holloway will understand the circumstances, though I imagine there will be even more gossip in town tomorrow." Owen's expression turned serious. "Does that bother you, being linked to me in town talk?" "Not at all," Bethany assured him. "Does it bother you?" "Only if it causes you discomfort," he replied. "I've never much cared what people say about me, but I wouldn't want their talk to harm your standing as the schoolteacher." Bethany smiled at his concern. "The school board hired me for my teaching abilities, not my personal life. Besides, I'm not ashamed of caring for you, Owen." His expression softened at her words. "I'm a fortunate man." That night, as Bethany lay in Owen's bed, surrounded by his scent and the quiet sounds of the ranch house settling in the cold, she reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. She had come west seeking a new beginning, never imagining that she would find love with a man whose past had been marked by such tragedy. Yet here she was, her heart full of feelings for Owen Sutherland, a man who had shown her both strength and tenderness, courage and vulnerability. When morning came, the world outside was transformed into a winter wonderland, the snow having stopped sometime during the night. After a hearty breakfast, Owen harnessed his horses to the wagon for the journey back to town. "I've been thinking," he said as they traveled the snow-covered road, "about Christmas." "What about it?" Bethany asked, snuggled close beside him under a thick buffalo robe. "I'd like to spend it with you," Owen said, his eyes on the road ahead. "And I was wondering if you might consider spending Christmas Eve at the ranch. Mrs. Holloway and some of the other town folk could join us for dinner to keep everything proper." Bethany was touched by both the invitation and his consideration for her reputation. "That sounds wonderful. I'd love to help you host a proper Christmas gathering." Owen smiled, visibly pleased by her acceptance. "I thought perhaps we could cut a tree from the pine grove near the house. Haven't had a Christmas tree since." He trailed off, but Bethany understood. "I think that would be perfect," she said, squeezing his arm. The next few weeks were filled with preparations for Christmas. Owen made more frequent trips to town, often bringing supplies for the school or small gifts for Bethany, a book of poetry, a handcrafted wooden box for her desk, wildflower honey from a beekeeper he knew. For her part, Bethany found herself planning the Christmas Eve gathering with increasing excitement. Mrs. Holloway agreed to attend, as did Reverend Thomas and his wife, the Petersons from the general store, and several other respectable members of the community whose presence would ensure that the evening remained above reproach in terms of propriety. 2 days before Christmas, Owen arrived in Rivercross with his wagon to transport Bethany and the various dishes and decorations she had prepared for the celebration to his ranch. The weather had turned milder, with clear skies that promised good traveling conditions. As they drove, Owen seemed unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. "Is everything all right?" Bethany asked, concerned by his silence. Owen glanced at her, then back at the road. "Just thinking about how different this Christmas will be from the last 8. Bethany placed her hand on his arm. "If it's too difficult, no," he interrupted gently. "It's not that, it's just, I never thought I'd want to celebrate again, let alone share my home with others." He covered her hand with his own. "You've changed that, Bethany. You've helped me remember what it's like to look forward to something again." His words filled her with warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sunshine. "I'm glad, Owen. Everyone deserves joy, especially during Christmas." When they reached the ranch, Owen surprised Bethany by taking her not to the house, but to a small grove of pine trees on the property. "Thought you might like to choose the tree yourself," he explained, producing an axe from the back of the wagon. Together, they selected a perfect specimen not too tall to fit in the main room, but full and fragrant with the scent of pine. Owen cut it down with practiced efficiency, and they loaded it onto the wagon to take to the house. Inside, they set up the tree near the fireplace. Bethany had brought simple decorations, paper stars, ribbons, and small carved wooden ornaments that some of her students had made as gifts. As they worked together to decorate the tree, Bethany found herself watching Owen's face, seeing the mixture of joy and wistful memory that crossed his features. "Emma loved Christmas," he said softly as he hung a small wooden star. "Used to wake us up before dawn, too excited to sleep." Bethany touched his arm gently. "It's all right to remember them with happiness, Owen. The good memories are gifts they left behind for you." He covered her hand with his own, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You're a wise woman, Bethany Sullivan." The Christmas Eve gathering was a success beyond Bethany's hopes. The house was warm and inviting, decorated with greenery and candles. The food was plentiful and delicious, with everyone contributing their specialties. Mrs. Holloway's pies, as always, were the highlight of the dessert table. Owen surprised everyone, perhaps himself most of all, by proving to be an excellent host. He guided conversations, made sure glasses and plates were never empty, and even joined in when Reverend Thomas suggested they sing carols around the piano that had belonged to Rebecca, and which Owen admitted he hadn't opened in years. As the evening wound down and guests prepared to leave, Mrs. Holloway pulled Bethany aside. "I owe you an apology, dear," the older woman said quietly. "Whatever for?" Bethany asked, surprised. Mrs. Holloway glanced toward Owen, who was bidding farewell to the Petersons. "I warned you about his shadows, but I didn't give enough credit to your light. I've never seen him like this, not in all the years since his tragedy. You've brought him back to life." Bethany felt tears prick at her eyes at the woman's words. "He's done the same for me in many ways. I came west feeling half alive myself after losing my parents." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "Then you've healed each other. There's no greater gift, especially at Christmas." After the last guest had departed, Owen and Bethany stood together before the Christmas tree, the room illuminated only by its candles and the dying fire. "Thank you," Owen said, taking her hands in his, "for making this house feel like a home again." "It was my pleasure," Bethany replied softly. Owen reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box tied with a simple ribbon. "I have something for you. An early Christmas gift." Bethany accepted the box with surprise. "But we agreed to exchange gifts tomorrow." "This one couldn't wait," Owen said, an unusual nervousness in his manner. Curious, Bethany untied the ribbon and opened the box. Inside lay a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. Her breath caught as she looked up at Owen questioningly. He took her hands in his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Bethany Sullivan, you came into my life unexpectedly, facing down coyotes and bringing light back into a world I thought would remain forever dark. I never imagined I could love again after losing Rebecca and Emma, but you've shown me that the heart has a remarkable capacity for renewal." He took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know it hasn't been long, and I would understand if you wanted more time, but I also know with absolute certainty that I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Joy filled Bethany's heart to overflowing. "Yes," she whispered, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Owen, I will marry you." Owen's face transformed with a smile of pure joy as he took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise of their future together. As they stood together in the glow of the Christmas tree, Bethany thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the grief that had driven her from Boston to the frontier town of Rivercross, from a frightening encounter with coyotes to finding love with the man who had saved her. Life's paths were indeed mysterious and wonderful, leading to destinations one could never predict. Outside, a light snow began to fall, adding another layer of pristine white to the landscape surrounding the ranch house. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Bethany and Owen stood at the threshold of their new life together, a life built on shared understanding, mutual respect, and the healing power of love that had found them both when they least expected it, but most needed it. Their wedding took place the following spring, when the valley Owen had once described to Bethany was indeed carpeted with wildflowers of every hue. The entire town of Rivercross turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church where Reverend Thomas officiated. Even Mrs. Holloway was seen dabbing at her eyes as Owen and Bethany exchanged their vows. For their honeymoon, Owen took Bethany to that special valley high in the mountains, where they stayed in a small cabin he had secretly built during the winter months. It was there, surrounded by the breathtaking beauty of the Wyoming wilderness, that Bethany truly understood what Owen had meant about finding peace. "I think I could stay here forever," she said as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and pink. Owen's arm tightened around her shoulders. "We can visit whenever you wish, but I thought you might prefer living primarily at the ranch, given your teaching position." Bethany turned to him with a smile. "You wouldn't mind continuing to live so close to town. I know how you value your solitude." "Some things are worth adjusting for," Owen replied, his eyes warm with love. "Besides, I find I don't need as much solitude these days, not with you in my life." As the years passed, the Sutherland Ranch became known as one of the most welcoming homes in the region. Bethany continued teaching for several years, until the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Catherine, after Bethany's mother. She was followed 2 years later by a son, whom they named James, after Owen's father. Owen gradually took fewer dangerous assignments, focusing instead on his ranch and occasionally guiding government surveyors or legitimate hunting parties. His expertise was sought after and well compensated, allowing the family to prosper. The Christmas Eve gathering became an annual tradition, growing larger each year as friends and neighbors came to expect the Sutherlands' hospitality. The house that had once stood silent and somber was now filled with laughter, music, and the happy chaos of family life. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Owen surprised Bethany with a special gift, a finely crafted locket containing miniature portraits of their children on one side, and on the other, a tiny painting of the spot where they had first met on the trail outside Rivercross. "To remind you," Owen said as he fastened it around her neck, "that sometimes the most frightening moments can lead to the greatest blessings." Bethany touched the locket, then reached up to caress his face, now adorned with distinguished streaks of silver at the temples. "I've never needed reminding of that day," she said softly. "It was the beginning of everything good in my life." Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Catherine now 8 and James 6, Bethany leaned against Owen's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" she asked. "If I hadn't walked that trail that evening, or if you hadn't happened to be riding by at that exact moment." Owen was quiet for a moment, his arm secure around her waist. "I used to believe life was mainly shaped by chance and misfortune," he finally said. "But now I'm not so sure. Maybe some meetings are meant to be." Bethany smiled, watching as James showed his sister how to twirl a rope the way Owen had taught him. "Like a schoolteacher from Boston and a Wyoming bounty hunter." "Exactly like that," Owen agreed, turning to press a kiss to her temple. "Exactly like us." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Bethany thought about the twists and turns of fate that had brought her to this place, this man, this life. From the moment Owen had fired his rifle into the air and told her she was safe with him, she had been on a journey toward home, not a place, but a feeling of belonging and security she had found in his arms. Life on the frontier remained challenging, with harsh winters and the occasional hardship, but facing those challenges together only strengthened the bond between them. The shadows of the past never completely disappeared. They still marked days of remembrance for Rebecca and Emma, and for Bethany's parents, but those shadows no longer defined their lives. Instead, Owen and Bethany Sutherland built a legacy of love, resilience, and generosity that extended far beyond the boundaries of their ranch. Students Bethany had taught went on to become teachers themselves, carrying her influence to new generations. Men Owen had mentored in tracking and wilderness skills became respected guides and lawmen throughout the territory. And at the heart of it all was the family they had created together, not just their children, but the extended family of friends and neighbors who had witnessed their journey from two wounded souls to a couple whose love story became something of a legend in Rivercross. Years later, when asked about the secret to their enduring marriage, Bethany would smile and say simply, "We found each other when we needed each other most, and we never forgot what a miracle that was." And Owen, a man of few words to the end, would add only, "Some treasures are worth protecting with everything you have. She's mine." In the end, it wasn't the dramatic rescue from coyotes that defined their story, but the countless quiet moments that followed, the shared joys and sorrows, the challenges overcome together, and the deep, abiding love that had healed them both and created a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. A legacy that began with a rifle shot in the gathering dusk and 7 simple words, "You're safe with me," and she always was.